I was at my desk in the office, trying to sort out the week's bills with the grim efficiency of a man who knew Wolfe would object to every item, when the front bell rang. Fritz was in the kitchen with something bubbling that smelled Italian enough to justify ignoring it, so I went. That door has opened to everything from ambassadors to killers, and I wasn't expecting either, but the man standing on the stoop looked like he'd taken a wrong turn out of a mortuary catalogue. He was tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing a black suit so sharp it could have slit a tomato. His shoes shone like he'd been polishing them with grief, and his face was the shade of paper kept too long in a damp drawer. When he said, "Mr. Goodwin," in a voice that had sand in it, I knew two things. He had rehearsed the line, and he wasn't about to ask me where to find Lexington Avenue. "Yes," I said, "that's me. But if you're here to sell burial plots, we're fresh out." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I've come to a matter that requires Mr. Wolfe's attention. Lucky you. He's in, but whether he's available is another question. What's the pitch?" He hesitated, as though weighing the exact number of words he could spend before I shut the door. Then he said, "It concerns a funeral, one that was already held, and another that should not be." That was novel enough to earn him an invitation. I led him to the office, where Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, eyes closed, pretending the world outside orchids did not exist. The man stood, hat in hand, waiting to be noticed. I cleared my throat. "Client candidate, sir, says he has a funeral problem," which makes him either in the wrong line of work or the right one. Wolfe's eyelids rose by half an inch. He focused on the black-suited figure. "Name?" "Griffin Tolliver," the man said. Wolfe gestured toward the red leather chair. "Explain." Tolliver sat stiff, like the chair's curves offended him. He placed his hat on his knee and looked at Wolfe with the steady stare of a man determined to keep himself from shaking. "2 weeks ago we buried my employer, Mr. Avery Ballantyne, a banker of some prominence. I attended, as did his family, his associates, and the obligatory reporters. The coffin was lowered, the earth was filled, and all the motions of finality were observed. So far," Wolfe said, "unremarkable." Tolliver's lips tightened. Last evening, a messenger arrived at the Ballantyne home with a sealed envelope addressed to Mrs. Ballantyne. Inside was a letter, in Mr. Ballantyne's hand. Dated 4 days ago. I leaned back, whistling softly. A man improving his penmanship underground. That is unusual. Wolfe shifted his bulk, not out of surprise, but to align himself with the absurd. "And you are certain of the handwriting?" Tolliver inclined his head. Mrs. Ballantyne confirmed it instantly. "I handled his correspondence for 7 years. It was his." "Content?" Wolfe demanded. Tolliver's voice thinned. It instructed his wife not to trust a man named Darian Clay, that he must not be permitted control of the estate. It also claimed that his death had been staged. Wolfe's eyebrows went up like reluctant theatre curtains. "Staged?" "Yes," Tolliver said. He wrote, "If you are reading this, then they have convinced you I am dead. I am not. Beware." Silence settled in. I've seen Wolfe treat nonsense with the contempt of a philosopher listening to a goat recite poetry, but this time he didn't dismiss it. His lips pursed. "Mr. Tolliver," Wolfe said at last, "you are here because Mrs. Ballantyne fears madness or fraud?" And I paused, the stiffness cracking for the first time. "I fear something worse. I want you to determine whether my employer is in his grave or if he is not." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Fui. If a corpse was interred, the answer lies in a coffin." "That does not require me." Tolliver's hand tightened on his hat. "You misunderstand. The city has already denied an exhumation order without stronger cause. The police consider the letter a prank. Mrs. Ballantyne refuses to endure public scandal. Yet the estate, immense sums, delicate holdings, is already shifting under Clay's direction. If Mr. Ballantyne lives, it is theft. If he is dead, it is something more sinister, and Clay has accelerated it. Either way, it threatens ruin. He took a breath, then delivered the clincher. You are the only man with a reputation formidable enough to halt Clay without the law's cooperation. That, I admit, was neatly phrased. Wolfe doesn't melt under compliments, but he respects the architecture of persuasion. He half opened one eye. Mr. Goodwin? Yes, sir. Ascertain the bona fides, speak with Mrs. Ballantyne, examine this letter, report. I knew then that Tolliver had succeeded. Wolfe wasn't admitting interest, but he was pricking his ears under the folds. Tolliver rose, relief smoothing his lined face. He left the envelope with me, promising Mrs. Ballantyne would expect my visit. When the door closed, I turned, eyebrows cocked. Do you believe him? I asked. I believe, Wolfe rumbled, that a corpse buried may or may not be the man it is claimed to be, and I believe that meddling heirs and ambitious associates are perennial, whether Mr. Ballantyne wrote that letter or whether someone composed it to splinter an estate. He spread his hands. That is the question. And you want me to find out which? Of course, you require occupation. I pocketed the letter, already considering angles, funeral directors, handwriting experts, and a widow who might be too polished to crack. But what struck me most as I left Wolfe dozing back into his chair was the look on Tolliver's face when he spoke of the second funeral, like a man who expected to attend it himself. When I set out the next morning, the envelope was folded flat in my inner pocket, and I had a sense I'd been cast as the errand boy for the dead. Wolfe had given me no more than his trademark grunt of sanction, which was as close as he came to a blessing, and then turned back to his orchids. My instructions were the usual vague variety: ascertain the bona fides, which meant, go stick your nose where it doesn't belong, Goodwin, and come back with something that smells of either fact or fraud. The Ballantyne house sat on a stretch of Upper Madison where wealth doesn't so much flaunt itself as settle into the stonework. It was tall and respectable, with brass fixtures that gleamed like they had been buffed hourly, and a doorman whose expression implied that anyone not owning half a bank had wandered in by mistake. I gave him my name and Wolfe's, and the name still had enough heft to get me upstairs without a search warrant. Mrs. Ballantyne received me in a sitting room that made me think of museum galleries where you're afraid to breathe too hard. She was in her 40s, still handsome, though grief had left her eyes shadowed and her cheekbones sharper. She didn't wear black instead, a pale dove-grey dress that said she was acknowledging bereavement without drowning in it. When I introduced myself, she managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Goodwin, Mr. Tolliver telephoned. He said you would come." "That's right," I said, taking a chair and keeping the envelope in view. "You have something unusual on your hands." She clasped her hands together, the fingers knotting. Unusual, yes. Terrifying, perhaps. I cannot decide if I'm being haunted or deceived. I opened the envelope carefully, drew out the letter, and set it on the table between us. "This is it." She leaned forward slightly. "It is Avery's hand. I know it as I know my own. His peculiar way of shaping the B, the slant of the ink, there is no mistaking it." "But the date," I said. 4 days ago. That would be nearly a week after his interment." "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "You must understand, Mr. Goodwin, my husband was not a man easily frightened. If he wrote that warning against Darian Clay, her lips trembled, but she formed them. Then he believed his life was in danger, and yet he died suddenly of a supposed heart failure in his office, with a physician to certify it. All very proper. Too proper. I let that simmer. "Tell me about Clay." Her voice cooled. "Darian Clay is my husband's protégé, a clever financier, charming, ambitious. Avery took him into his confidence too quickly, in my opinion. He has already begun consolidating control of certain holdings under legal pretexts, of course. If Avery is truly gone, then perhaps that is his right. But if Avery lives, then Clay is seizing more than he should, I finished. She inclined her head. Would you allow me, I said, to have this letter examined by someone who knows their way around ink and paper? Yes, but discreetly. I will not have the newspapers feasting on this. I agreed to see you only because Mr. Tolliver insists Mr. Wolfe is unique. That was polite shorthand for saying Wolfe had a reputation for genius mixed with irritation. I told her I'd keep matters quiet and asked a few more questions. Funeral arrangements, who handled the body, who had access. Each answer painted the same picture, nothing out of line, no whisper of irregularity. Too neat, Wolfe would say. On my way out, I nearly collided with a man coming down the hall. He was younger than me by a few years, trim, dark-haired, and had the smile of someone used to charming secretaries and widows alike. He looked me over with a flicker of suspicion hidden under courtesy. "Archie Goodwin, isn't it?" he said, smoothly. "I'm Darian Clay." The timing was bad for him and good for me. I confirmed my name, and he laughed lightly. "Of course. Wolfe's legman, I've heard the stories." "Then you know better than to underestimate me," I said pleasantly. "Not at all. Only to wonder why you're sniffing around. This is a time for mourning, not investigations." His tone was pleasant enough, but there was steel under it. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's a time for making sure the right people are running the show." His eyes flashed just briefly, then the smile returned. "Mrs. Ballantyne has no concerns, neither should you. Convey my regards to Wolfe." I left before the conversation turned into a fencing match neither of us was ready to finish. But as I rode downtown in a cab, the picture began to sharpen. Mrs. Ballantyne was convinced of her husband's hand. Clay oozes charm and ambition, a letter that couldn't exist unless someone had reached through dirt and wood to write it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was finishing lunch. He motioned me to sit, and Fritz brought me a plate without asking. Between bites I gave him the rundown, the widow's certainty, Clay's entrance, the too smooth circumstances of Ballantyne's demise. I finished with the line, "If it's a hoax, it's a good one. If it isn't, we're dealing with the ghost who mails letters." Wolfe chewed thoughtfully, then wiped his lips. "Bah! Ghosts do not write. Men do. Either Mr. Ballantyne did, in which case he lives, or another man did with his pen and paper in hand, find where and how the letter was written, and by whom. That is your task. I slid the letter toward him. He didn't touch it, just glanced. The paper is commercial, the ink standard. The formality of the phrasing suggests a deliberate attempt to impress upon the widow the gravity of the situation. It is both too composed and too dramatic. Which means, I asked, which means it was intended not as communication, but as manipulation. The widow is the target, not the beneficiary. That was Wolfe's way of lighting a fuse under me without lifting a finger. I knew what came next, long hours tracing stationery, checking postmarks, maybe cornering the delivery boy. He leaned back, eyes closing. "Saul may be useful. Consult him." "I want the origin of that letter." "And if it turns out Mr. Ballantyne is actually dead?" I asked. Wolfe's eyes stayed shut, but his lips curved slightly. "Then someone else has arranged a second funeral for Mrs. Ballantyne's peace of mind, and for your own bewilderment." I let that sit while finishing lunch. There was a lot to chase Clay's smirk, Tolliver's devotion, and a widow teetering between hope and dread. And Wolfe, immovable in his chair, had already decided this was worth his attention. That alone told me the brownstone was about to get a parade of visitors, whether Wolfe liked it or not. When I left again that afternoon, the city felt sharper, like the sidewalks knew I was hunting for a dead man who might not be dead at all. And somewhere in the shadows of finance and grief, somebody was smiling, waiting to see if Wolfe could untangle the knots before the second funeral arrived. The first step was always to nail down the mechanics, and for that Wolfe had pointed me to Saul Panzer. If you want something followed, sniffed out, or traced with the delicacy of a cat burglar and the accuracy of a Swiss watch, Saul's your man. That afternoon I put the letter into his hands with instructions from Wolfe to find out where it came from, who carried it, and whether the handwriting matched Ballantyne's in the eyes of anyone besides his wife and secretary. Saul took it like it was another day at the office, which for him it was, and promised results. That freed me to do some legwork of my own. Clay had been too smooth, too perfectly timed in his appearance at the Ballantyne house, and Wolfe doesn't believe in coincidences, neither do I, at least not when they arrive in silk ties. I put in a call to Lon Cohen at the Gazette and arranged to meet him for coffee. Lon has a nose for gossip that never fails, and he owed me for a tip I'd fed him a few months back that turned into a front-page spread. "Darian Clay?" he said, stirring sugar into his cup. He's been making waves. Came out of nowhere about 5 years ago, some investment house with a name that sounded like a barbershop. Got lucky with a couple of big deals, then attached himself to Ballantyne. People say Ballantyne treated him like a son, but you know how those stories go. Son or snake, depending on who's talking. "What about enemies?" I asked. Lon grinned. "Archie, in finance. Everyone's an enemy. But if you want dirt, talk to Miriam Kerr. She was Ballantyne's personal assistant before Tolliver left under a cloud. Rumor is she and Clay didn't see eye to eye. That was good enough for me." I called in a couple of markers, and by evening I was knocking on Miriam Kerr's apartment door in a building that had seen better days back before Prohibition. She opened it herself, a redhead with sharp eyes and sharper edges. "Archie Goodwin," she said, narrowing her gaze. "What do you want?" "To talk about Ballantyne and Clay." Her laugh was short and not sweet. "Clay. That oily climber. He's the reason I don't work for Avery anymore," Clay whispered, poison in his ear, making him think I was stealing. I wasn't, but Avery believed him. That's Clay's gift. He makes lies taste like truth. I kept my expression neutral. And now Ballantyne's dead. That gave her pause, her lips pressed tight. "Dead, maybe, but you wouldn't be here unless you doubted it." I told her just enough about the letter to see her reaction. Her eyebrows shot up, but then she nodded slowly. If anyone could arrange something like that, it'd be Clay. He knows people. Unsavory ones. He could fake anything if it got him ahead. "Anyone else with motive?" I asked. Miriam tilted her head, considering. Ballantyne's son, Michael. He and Avery fought constantly about money, about responsibility. Michael wanted more freedom, more cash, and Avery was old-fashioned about discipline. If Avery really is gone, Michael inherits a slice. If not, he's still in chains. That was one more suspect for the list. I thanked her, left her with a card in case she remembered more, and headed back to the brownstone. By the time I walked into Wolfe's office, he was knee-deep in beer and attitude. I gave him the summary of Clay's ambition, Miriam's bitterness, Michael's resentment. Wolfe listened with half-shut eyes, his lips twitching only once when I described Clay as making lies taste like truth. "And Tolliver?" Wolfe asked. "Straight arrow by all accounts. Loyal to Ballantyne. If he's hiding something, it's behind a wall 10 feet thick." Wolfe grunted. "Loyalty is a quality both rare and dangerous. Never mistake it for honesty." I was about to answer when the front bell rang. Fritz showed in a young man who looked like he'd been carved out of frustration. Dark hair rumpled, tie askew, and eyes burning the way only someone who's had money dangled just out of reach can burn. "Michael Ballantyne," he said tersely, and dropped into the red leather chair without waiting for an invitation. Wolfe didn't appreciate the presumption, but he tolerated it. "Your purpose?" Michael leaned forward, hands clenched. "I heard you're sniffing around my father's death. Don't waste your time. He's gone. The doctors said so. The funeral proved it." "Yet you trouble yourself to say so," Wolfe replied. Michael flushed. "Because Tolliver and my stepmother are stirring nonsense. A letter from the grave? Absurd. And Clay's taking advantage. He claims he's executing father's wishes, but I don't believe it. He's tightening his grip and I'm shut out." There it was. "Not grief, resentment?" I asked. "And what's your position, Michael? Want a piece of the pie, or to see Clay topple?" "Both," he snapped. Then he caught himself, sat back, and tried to smooth his expression. "Look, if you can prove Clay's a fraud, do it. But don't chase ghosts. My father is dead. Accept it." He stood abruptly and stalked out before Wolfe could dismiss him. The silence that followed was thick enough to slice. "Impulsive," Wolfe murmured. "Self-interested. But not, I think, the architect." "Which leaves Clay," I said. "Or some other name yet to crawl out." Wolfe nodded. "The circle begins to form. Mrs. Ballantyne, loyal yet uncertain. Tolliver, dutiful yet anxious. Clay, ambitious and unscrupulous. Kerr, embittered, with grievance. Michael, resentful, impatient, each with motive, each with opportunity. And at the centre, a corpse or the lack of one." "Saul will trace the letter," I said. "Maybe that'll cut the circle down, perhaps. Or perhaps it will enlarge it." Wolfe reached for another beer. "Meanwhile, Mr. Goodwin, continue your excavation of these people. Their words will contradict, and in contradiction lies truth." That was the closing gong for me. The suspects were in place: a widow, a secretary, a son, a protégé, and a loyal aide. All of them circled around the mystery of a banker who might be underground or might be playing possum. And Wolfe, immovable as ever, would wait for me to drag back the threads. When I left the office that night, I had the uneasy sense that someone else had just joined the circle, someone not yet seen, but already pulling strings. And I'd need to find them before Clay decided a second funeral would tidy things up for good. The next morning, Saul called to report. His voice was steady as always, the kind that never betrayed whether he'd been following a jewel thief or a schoolteacher. "The letter was mailed from a box on East 74th, he said. "Postmark confirms it. Paper is stock you can buy at a dozen stationers, but I traced one bundle sold last week to a shop near Clay's office. No proof it's the same, but suggestive. As for handwriting, I had a sample Ballantyne check pulled from the bank records. The match is strong. Either he wrote it, or someone damn good did." I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe, who had been tending to his orchids in the morning session, returned to the office in time for the report. He listened with eyelids lowered to half-mast, which is his version of taking notes. "Mr. Clay's proximity to the stationery is troublesome," Wolfe said, "but not conclusive." "Continue." That was his way of saying I should get my shoes scuffed again. So I did. First stop was the bank itself, Ballantyne & Co., where the offices smelled like polished mahogany and repression. I managed to charm a junior officer into talking, the kind who still thought my suit looked respectable. He told me Avery Ballantyne had been seen in good health the week before his death, still dictating memos and snapping at underlings. His collapse in the office had come as a surprise, but the attending physician, Dr. Lionel Reeves, certified it as heart failure. Convenient, tidy, no autopsy requested. I took down the details and asked to see Clay's office. It was slick, modern, with too much glass and chrome for a man supposedly apprenticed to tradition. Clay wasn't in, but his secretary gave me a once-over sharp enough to peel wallpaper. She confirmed Clay was now interim executor of certain responsibilities, which sounded like a polite way of saying he had the keys to the vault. From there, I headed uptown to track down Dr. Reeves. He lived in a townhouse that was as precise as his reputation, and he greeted me with professional courtesy that had just enough frost in it to keep the riffraff out. "I certified Mr. Ballantyne's passing," Reeves said when I explained myself. "There was nothing unusual about it." He collapsed. I examined him. His history suggested cardiac weakness. Natural, if unfortunate. "Wasn't it sudden?" I pressed. "Heart failures often are." He said it smoothly, but there was a faint shadow in his expression, something that suggested he'd rehearsed this line a few too many times. When I asked if he'd spoken to the widow since, he shook his head curtly. "Not my place." My duty ended with the certificate. By the time I left, I wasn't convinced. He hadn't lied, but the gaps in his answers were as wide as the East River. That evening, Wolfe summoned me to report. I gave him the rundown, the paper trail, the bank details, and the doctor's neat explanation. He listened in silence, eyes shut, hands steepled in his middle. When I finished, he opened one eye. "Pfui. Too orderly, too neat. You think it's staged?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe said, "that when every element of a man's death falls into place without friction, the hand of artifice is near. Nature is clumsy, men are clever. Remember that." The bell rang before I could argue, and Fritz showed up in Miriam Kerr, the ex-secretary. She swept in with the air of a woman who had decided her grievances deserved an audience. Wolfe inclined his head an inch, and she launched. "I thought about what you said, Mr. Goodwin," she began. "If Ballantyne is alive, then Clay is his jailer. If he is dead, Clay is his thief. Either way, you should know that Clay has been meeting with a man named Vernon Lyle, a broker with a taste for shady deals. I overheard them once, months ago. Something about shifting funds off the books, Ballantyne suspected, but Clay talked him down." Wolfe's eyes gleamed faintly. "Are you certain?" "I stake my reputation. Clay is not just ambitious, he is crooked. If Ballantyne tried to stop him, perhaps that's why he had to vanish." Wolfe thanked her in his minimalist way, which meant a nod and nothing more. After she left, he turned to me. "You will locate this Vernon Lyle," he said, "ascertain his connection, and you will revisit Michael Ballantyne. His passions make him indiscreet. Exploit that." I grunted, but it was better than going back to Reeves for another round of polished denial. Lyle wasn't hard to find. Men who make fast money leave tracks, and this leads to a club downtown where the air was thick with cigars and regrets. I caught him between drinks, a heavy-set man with eyes that rolled too easily. When I dropped Clay's name, his smile froze. "Never heard of him?" he said. "Try again," I suggested, "or I'll find someone less polite to ask." That got me a glare, but then a shrug. "All right." Clay came to me about moving some funds discreetly. He said Ballantyne was too conservative, that he wanted to prove his own initiative. I thought it was hot air, so I let it drop. Then suddenly Ballantyne drops dead, and Clay's back in the saddle. I don't touch it now. Too hot. That was enough for me. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the news. Wolfe didn't gloat, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "Clay is reckless," he said. "That is useful. Men who overreach expose themselves." "And Michael?" I asked. "Bring him here again. Stir his envy. We must see who profits by his father's death or his father's absence." Which is how I found myself the following night, sitting across from Michael Ballantyne in a bar on 52nd. He was already on his second drink, and it didn't take much nudging to loosen his tongue. "Clay's stealing everything," he hissed, "and Mother believes him. Tolliver's too blind to see it. If Father were alive, he'd stop it, but he's not, damn him. And if he is alive and hiding, it's worse." Worse. Why worse? I asked, keeping my tone light. "Because it means he abandoned us. Me. Left me to beg from Clay. That's unforgivable." His face twisted, and for a second I thought he might smash the glass. Instead, he slumped back. "If you find him alive, Goodwin, don't expect me to welcome him." That was telling. Resentment ran deeper than grief. When I brought it back to Wolfe, he only grunted. Noted, a son who would prefer his father dead rather than absent is capable of dangerous folly. Keep him in sight. The pieces were moving, and Wolfe was watching the board with that inward stare of his, the one that meant he already saw the trap. I had a circle of suspects, a crooked protégé, a resentful son, a loyal secretary, a widow caught in the middle, and a banker who might be breathing or might be dust. The next step would push someone to make a mistake. I had the feeling Wolfe was already arranging it without leaving his chair. By the following afternoon, I was starting to feel like the city had been turned into one big echo chamber, every lid bouncing back with just enough noise to keep me running. Saul was still trailing the paper trail. Fritz had reported that Wolfe had added a third bottle of beer to his lunch, rotational ways, a sign of mental fermentation, and I was due to make another pass at Mrs. Ballantyne to test her nerves. When I arrived at the Ballantyne house, Tolliver met me at the door. He looked pale and strained, as though someone had been plucking at his nerves with tweezers. He hustled me inside and lowered his voice. "There's been a disturbance," he said. "Something small but troubling. I don't like small disturbances. They're the kind that get magnified later." "Show me." He led me to Mr. Ballantyne's study, which had been left intact since the funeral, as if preserving the shrine of a departed saint. Tolliver pointed to the desk. One of the drawers was ajar by an inch, and inside it the contents were jumbled. "It was locked," he said. "I am certain of it. I checked yesterday." And now this. I crouched, examined. The lock wasn't broken. It had been opened with a key or a clever hand. The jumble wasn't random. Papers shifted, some placed out of order, as though someone had searched carefully. But not too carefully. A whisper of deliberate untidiness, enough to be noticed. "Anything missing?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not that I can tell, but this was in the front." He handed me a sheet of stationery, crisp, blank, but embossed with the Ballantyne crest. I frowned. "Just a page of letterhead?" "Yes." But the stack was in the back. This was set in front, as if meant to be seen. That gave me a chill, a staged disturbance, like a ghost nudging the living. I pocketed the page. Who's been in here? No one, only myself, Mrs. Ballantyne, and Clay, when he insists on reviewing papers. The servants don't enter, they know better. And yet I said, "Someone's been trespassing." When I reported it to Wolfe that evening, he sat in his chair, eyes half shut, rolling the idea on his tongue like a vintage wine. "Deliberate," he murmured. The drawer disturbed, the paper left visible. "A message, Mr. Goodwin. Someone wishes Mrs. Ballantyne and Tolliver believe the dead man's hand still moves. Or Clay wants to spook them into giving him control faster," I suggested. "Possibly. But crude for Clay. He is too practiced in charm to dabble in theatrics. No, this smacks of another hand. Someone who wishes to blur reality. It is a stratagem of fog." I didn't like the sound of that. Fog gets men lost. The next morning I returned to the Ballantyne house to speak with Mrs. Ballantyne directly about the disturbance. She listened, her hands twisting in her lap, and nodded slowly. Avery was meticulous about his study. No one would dare intrude. If it has been disturbed, then perhaps he did it himself. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide, trembling. "Mr. Goodwin, if he lives, if he has been near, should I not rejoice?" "That depends," I said gently, "on why he'd be sneaking into his own house instead of walking through the front door." She flinched. I knew I'd struck the truth. Her hope was tangled with fear. If Ballantyne was alive, what had kept him away? Leaving her unsettled, I went back downtown to see if Clay had alibis for the last night. He wasn't pleased to find me waiting in his slick office, but he smiled anyway. the smile that could sell poison as perfume. Goodwin, I hope you're not planning to rent space here. What do you want now? Just a routine check, I said. Where were you last night? His eyes narrowed, but he laughed. Am I under interrogation? Shall I summon my attorney? You could, I said, but then I'd just assume you were hiding something. He leaned back, still smiling. Dinner with clients at the Union Club. Ask the maitre d'. Ask anyone. Really, Archie, this is beneath you. Scrambling about drawers and ghosts. Why not let the dead rest? That word ghost was too on the nose. Either he'd heard about the disturbance already, or he was poking to see what I knew. I filed that away and moved on to Michael Ballantyne. He answered his apartment door looking hungover and hostile, which made two constants. When I mentioned the study had been rifled, his eyes lit, then darkened. Clay? He spat. It has to be Clay. Always digging, always twisting. He'll drive Mother mad with his games. I studied with him. You don't think about your father. No, he barked, then softer. Or if he did, then he's worse than dead to me. He rubbed his temples. Look, Goodwin, I don't care if Clay robs the estate blind. I just want it done. If father is alive and playing tricks, then I'll cut himself short, eyes blazing, then slam the door. That night, back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened without opening his eyes. I described the disturbed drawer, the planted paper, the widow's hope, Clay's polished alibi, Michael's venom. At last, Wolfe opened one eye. A second trespass, Mr. Goodwin. First the letter, now the drawer. A pattern emerges. Someone is cultivating ambiguity, ensuring that neither life nor death can be accepted. Until we know who benefits from this ambiguity, we are blind. And who does benefit? I pressed. That, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, is what you will discover. Return to the study. Search again. This time, not for what is missing, but for what has been added. I didn't argue. Wolfe's nose for details hidden in plain sight had saved us more than once. The thought of going back into that study with its air of absent presence didn't thrill me. But if Ballantyne's ghost was leaving messages, I intended to catch him or whoever was writing his script. The fog was thickening, and Wolfe meant to clear it by forcing me right into the middle of it. I went back to the Ballantyne house the following day, feeling like a man invited to dance with shadows. Tolliver let me in, still looking like he hadn't slept. He took me straight to the study without a preamble, which was fine because small talk with Tolliver was like chatting with a granite bust. The room smelled faintly of dust and polish, the air heavy with absence. I started my sweep desk, cabinets, rug edges and book spines. Wolfe's advice was to look for what had been added, not removed, and that gave me focus. I found it within 10 minutes. Behind a row of ledgers on the bottom shelf was a folded slip of paper, crisp and clean, positioned so it would slide out if the books were touched. I eased it open. One line, handwritten, I am not finished. Watch Clay. The same hand as the first letter. I stared at it, the hair on the back of my neck staging a revolt. This wasn't forgotten correspondence. This was fresh planting, and whoever left it wanted it discovered by me or by Tolliver or by Mrs. Ballantyne. I tucked it into my pocket before Tolliver could lean too far over my shoulder. He was pale enough already. Find anything? He asked. Nothing I'd call decisive, I said, which was technically true. On the way back, I called Saul, gave him the line, and asked him to check for anything posted near the Ballantyne residence, Barch couriers, unusual movements. Saul didn't waste words. I'll see what turns up. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already installed in the office with beer number 2. I handed him the slip. He held it gingerly, studied it, and let out a sigh that was almost a growl. Not finished. Pfui. A contrivance? You're saying it's fake? I asked. I am saying, Wolfe rumbled, that a man intent on secrecy does not scatter notes like breadcrumbs. This is theatre, and theatre requires an audience. Mrs. Ballantyne. Precisely, she is being pushed toward conviction. But conviction of what? That her husband lives, or that Clay is guilty? Both serve to unmoor her judgment. Who profits from her instability? That was the question, and Wolfe wasn't ready to answer it. He did, however, decide it was time to widen the net. Mr. Goodwin, summon Saul here tonight. I want his observations firsthand. Also invite Mr. Clay. Tell him Mrs. Ballantyne has expressed doubts about his stewardship. That will stir him. I grinned. And you'll just sit back and watch? As always, that evening Saul arrived first, immaculate as ever, and gave his report to a messenger seen loitering near the Ballantyne property. No deliveries recorded. A hired errand boy, most likely, dropping a planted note. The handwriting analysis still leaned toward genuine, but Saul's tone suggested he smelled something off too. Then came Clay. He walked into Wolfe's office as though it were his own boardroom, all smiles and polish, until he saw Saul and me bracketing him like bookends. He adjusted, smiled wider, and aimed his charm at Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe, what an honour. I understand Mrs. Ballantyne has concerns. I hope you'll allow me to reassure you both. The estate is in capable hands. Wolfe didn't move. Hands, yes, but whose interests do they serve? Clay chuckled. Why, the family's, of course. My dear Mrs. Ballantyne relies on me, yet she doubts, Wolfe said softly. That cracked the smile for half a second. She is under strain. Who wouldn't be? But really, gentlemen, chasing whispers of letters and ghosts, we must live in the present. I leaned forward. Funny you mention letters, Clay, because another one turned up in the study. Same handwriting. Naming you, that broke the charm altogether. His eyes widened, then narrowed. Absurd. Conveniently found, no doubt, by you? You're trying to frame me? Wolfe lifted a finger. Enough. Mr. Clay, consider yourself warned. You may protest your innocence, but until the fog lifts, suspicion clings to you. I suggest caution in your dealings. Extravagance in either guilt or innocence will betray you. Clay stood, stiff, eyes flashing. I'll not be slandered in this way. No one slanders, Wolfe said. Calm as granite. You slander yourself with every protest. Clay left with his charm turned into steel. Saul gave a low whistle. He's rattled. If he's guilty, you'll have him soon. If he's not, someone's painting a fine target on his back. After Saul left, Wolfe sat back, fingers drumming on the chair's arm. We are pressed. The trespasses grow bolder. The theatre expands. The next act will not be delayed. He was right. The next act arrived the following morning. I was at the brownstone early, reading the paper and sipping coffee when the front bell rang. Fritz answered, and moments later a uniformed officer stepped in, followed by Inspector Kramer himself. Kramer looked like a thundercloud that had been given legs. "All right, Goodwin," he barked. "Where's Wolfe? We've got a mess, and his fingerprints are all over it." I guided him to the office, where Wolfe was already waiting, more serene than a man should be, with Kramer looming over him. "What is it, Inspector?" Wolfe asked mildly. "A break-in," Kramer snapped. "At the Ballantyne vaults. Someone tried to remove documents, and we found this." He slapped a slip of paper onto the desk. It was another note, same handwriting. "Stop, Clay," before it was too late. Wolfe didn't touch it. How clumsy, as though guilt were a mask worn in daylight. Kramer glared. "Cut the poetry. If you know what's going on, spill it. Otherwise I'll drag you and your errand boy down to headquarters." Inspector Wolfe said, unruffled, "We are all being played. The hand that leaves these notes does not accuse it of entangling. Pursue Clay if you like, but the true culprit lies elsewhere." Kramer growled, swore, and stomped out, leaving the paper behind. I stared at Wolfe. "You just painted a bigger target on Clay." "Yes," Wolfe said calmly. And if Clay is innocent, the true culprit will act to ensure his downfall. Pressure, Archie, is the solvent of deception. We are approaching the fracture. I didn't argue, but as I slipped the new note into a folder, I had the uneasy feeling Wolfe was turning up the heat deliberately, and that someone, Clay, Michael, or the ghost of Ballantyne, was about to crack wide open. Kramer's visit left a stink in the office, thicker than one of Wolfe's rare cigars. He'd stormed out, but his warning shot was clear. Clay's neck was in the noose, and if Wolfe didn't supply an alternative soon, the police would tighten it. Wolfe sat motionless, fingers pressed together like a man sculpting air. He didn't need to say he was thinking the silence stretched long enough to feel like an extra body in the room. Finally, he said, "We must force the hand. The author of these notes believes himself clever, but he has shown compulsion. He cannot resist planting clues, manufacturing ambiguity. He will continue. We must create the condition that draws him into the open." "That's vague enough," I said. "Want to be specific?" His lips curved faintly. "Yes. We shall bait him with certainty. If ambiguity is his tool, then certainty will be his trigger. You will inform the principals, Mrs. Ballantyne, Tolliver, Michael, and Clay, that I have reached a conclusion. Tell them I intend to announce it at a gathering in my office. Their reactions will expose the seams." I whistled. "The big show?" "Already?" "Not the denouement," Wolfe said. "A rehearsal. The guilty cannot endure rehearsal." I spent the rest of the day doing his errands, which meant braving Clay's glare again, enduring Michael's drunken tirade, and calming a widow on the edge of hysteria. Tolliver, as usual, accepted everything with grim obedience. Each one agreed to come, though none happily. That evening, when the house settled into its quiet rhythm, Wolfe dictated a few letters, had Fritz prepare a meal that would have calmed an army, and then leaned back with the satisfied air of a man setting a trap too elegant to fail. The gathering was set for the next night, but the case wasn't about to wait politely. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Saul, and Saul doesn't waste words at that hour. "Goodwin," he said, "someone's tailing me. Been on me since I left a print shop near Clay's office. Whoever it is, they're good, but not good enough. Thought you should know. I told him to be careful and ring off if he caught them. Then I went to Wolfe's room, knocked, and gave him the news. He listened, eyes still half closed from his evening session with orchids, and nodded once. As expected, he murmured. Saul's diligence threatened the fabric. The author moves to watch him. Good, very good. I went back to bed wondering if Wolfe actually enjoyed putting lives on the line, as long as it meant sharpening his theory. By morning, Saul reported he'd shaken the tale. Description: medium height, broad shoulders, cautious, not Clay, not Michael. Too vague to pin down, but another piece in the fog. The appointed hour came, and the brownstone braced itself for disruption. Fritz polished the silver. Wolfe arranged his bulk behind the desk like a monarch receiving tribute, and I lined up chairs with the precision of a firing squad. They arrived in sequence: Mrs. Ballantyne, pale but resolute Tolliver, stiff as ever Michael, jittery with anger, Clay, smooth with forced composure. Each cast wary glances at the others, but Wolfe's presence was a weight that held them all in check. When they were seated, Wolfe cleared his throat. "You are gathered," he said, "because ambiguity cannot continue. A man either lives or his dead estates are either stolen or preserved. Tonight I propose to end the ambiguity that snapped heads up like marionettes tugged by strings." Clay's lips tightened. Michael flushed. Mrs. Ballantyne trembled. Tolliver blinked rapidly. "I shall deliver my conclusion," Wolfe continued, "but not yet. I wish first to observe you as you sit with the knowledge that certainty approaches. How you bear that knowledge will tell me much." Michael shot to his feet. This is a game! You're toying with us!" "Sit," Wolfe commanded, and the weight in his voice dragged Michael back down. Clay spoke next, silk covering iron. "Mr. Wolfe, this is theatre, nothing more. If you have proof, show it. Otherwise you insult us." "You mistake me," Wolfe said coldly. "I insult no one, but I will not be in a hurry. Certainty arrives in its own time." The tension thickened, and I could see sweat beads on Michael's brow, Clay's knuckles whitening, Mrs. Ballantyne twisting a handkerchief to threads. Tolliver sat rigid, but his eyes flicked toward Clay more than once. After an hour of silent torment, Wolfe dismissed them with a casual wave. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Return then, and we shall end this." They filed out, each carrying a burden heavier than when they entered. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. "Well, what did you get?" "Everything," Wolfe said. "Michael's fury is raw and uncontrolled. Clay's charm has cracked. Mrs. Ballantyne's hope has curdled into dread. Tolliver is brittle with strain. Each shows their fracture. Now the culprit must act swiftly before I speak tomorrow. That act will condemn him. I wanted to press, but Wolfe was already leaning back, eyes closing. "Stay alert, Archie. Tonight and tomorrow watch." The guilty hand cannot resist. He was right. The guilty hand struck before dawn. At 4 a.m, the phone jarred me awake. It was Saul again. His voice clipped. "Goodwin, emergency. Someone broke into the Ballantyne house. Tolliver caught them and was knocked cold. They fled. I only caught the tail end dark coat. Quick, gone. I was dressed in under 3 minutes and out the door, but by the time I reached the house, the intruder was long gone. Tolliver was being tended by a doctor, a bruise rising on his temple. He swore he hadn't seen the face, only that the man went straight for the study, as though looking for something specific. The study was in chaos now, drawers emptied, books flung. But what chilled me was the page lying on the desk in that same unmistakable handwriting, "The truth ends tomorrow." I brought it back to Wolfe at dawn. He read it, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at me and said, "Archie, we are very close. Tonight we'll decide it. The trespasser has declared his final act. He believes he controls the stage, but the stage is mine. I believed him." But as I set the note down, I couldn't shake the thought that if Wolfe was wrong, we might be preparing for a funeral of our own. By the time evening came, the brownstone was tighter than a drum. Wolfe had instructed Fritz to prepare the front room with more chairs than usual, though he grumbled about the intrusion into his sanctum. The yellow chair was polished, the globe lamps burned soft, and Wolfe himself sat behind his desk like a general who had already seen the battlefield won. I had spent the day tying knots. Michael Ballantyne had been easy to reach. He came snarling and restless, muttering about Clay and ghosts. Mrs. Ballantyne was pale, trembling, but she agreed, though I could tell every fibre of her wanted to flee. Tolliver came dutifully, his composure stretched thinner than ever. And Clay came with the smoothness of a man who suspected an ambush but believed charm would see him through. They filed into Wolfe's office one by one. The air grew thick as suspicion settled in, each glance cutting sharper than words. Wolfe waited until they were all seated, his hands steepled, his eyes half closed. "You know why you are here," he said finally, voice heavy and deliberate. "For weeks ambiguity has clouded Mr. Ballantyne's fate. Letters, notes, trespasses each designed to bewilder. But ambiguity is a tool wielded by men, not by the dead. Tonight we strip it away." The silence was so taut you could pluck it like a violin string. "Mrs. Ballantyne," Wolfe said, turning his gaze on her, "you received the first letter. You believe it to be your husband's hand?" She nodded shakily. "Yes, I know it, and yet you have not seen him, though he claims to live. That contradiction alone should have curbed your certainty." Her lips parted. but she made no reply. "Mr. Tolliver," Wolfe continued, "you are loyal, perhaps too loyal. Loyalty blinds as effectively as deceit. You guard the widow's faith as though it were your own." Tolliver stiffened, his jaw set, but he gave a brief nod. "Michael," Wolfe said, his tone sharper, "you claim you desire truth, yet your passion is for release from your father's shadow, from Clay's hand, from duty. If your father lives, you despise him for abandonment. If he is dead, you despise him for control. Either way, you gain by ambiguity." Michael shot up half out of his chair, his face blazing. "That's not sit," Wolfe commanded, and Michael sat breathing hard. "And Mr. Clay," Wolfe said, his gaze landing at last, "you are accused by every note, every whisper, too obvious. An ambitious man does not advertise his guilt in another man's hand, and yet you are marked again and again." Clay's smile faltered. "Because someone wants me ruined." "That's the truth, Wolfe. I may be ambitious, but I am no stranger. Someone's using Ballantyne's name to hang me." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "Which leaves us the central question, who profits most from ambiguity?" He let the silence stretch. Mrs. Ballantyne's hands clenched her handkerchief until the fabric frayed. Tolliver's eyes darted restless. Michael stared at the rug as though willing it to burn. Clay sat rigid, all pretense of charm gone. At last Wolfe spoke again, his voice like iron laid flat. "The answer will be given tonight, but before I pronounce it, know that the guilty hand has already betrayed itself. The trespasses, the planted notes, the theatre of haunting are not the work of Ballantyne risen, but of one who could mimic his hand, who had access to his papers, who knew his habits well enough to deceive even his widow." Mrs. Ballantyne gasped softly. "You mean yes," Wolfe said. "The letters were not written from the grave. They were crafted here, in this city, by a hand close to you all. A hand so desperate to direct suspicion onto Clay that it could not resist embellishment. But embellishment is excess, and excess reveals the author." I glanced around the room. Every eye was fixed on Wolfe, but in different ways. Clay's sharp with fear, Michael's wide with panic, Tolliver's unblinking with tension, Mrs. Ballantyne's brimming with confusion. Wolfe's gaze travelled from one to the next, resting at last on Tolliver. His voice lowered, each word weighted. "Mr. Tolliver, you were the first to bring us the letter. You vouched for its authenticity. You alone had continuous access to Ballantyne's study. You alone could plant what seemed credible while steering suspicion onto Clay. Your loyalty, so loudly professed, is a mask. In truth, you authored the ambiguity. You, sir, wrote the funeral that came twice." The silence shattered as Michael leapt to his feet, shouting, "I knew it wasn't me!" Clay swore under his breath, his face twisted with relief and anger combined. Mrs. Ballantyne stared at Tolliver, her mouth trembling, unable to form words. Tolliver rose slowly, his face pale but composed, his voice low. "You presume too much, Wolfe. I served Mr. Ballantyne faithfully for years. Why would I?" "Because," Wolfe interrupted, "you feared erasure. Ballantyne's trust in Clay threatened your position. The estate shifting into Clay's control would make you obsolete. So you invented a ghost, your master's hand reaching beyond the grave, to sow chaos, to halt Clay's rise, to preserve your place by making yourself indispensable. Each note, each staged trespass was your insurance." Tolliver's jaw clenched, his eyes flicked, just once, toward Mrs. Ballantyne, and that was enough. A silent plea or an admission. Wolfe's voice sharpened. "You overreached. A true ghost would not scatter his warnings so theatrically. You betrayed yourself in your zeal. And tonight you intended another trespass to seal Clay's ruin. But you will not have the chance." Kramer chose that moment to burst in as though Wolfe had arranged it. He must have been waiting in the hall, primed by a quiet call Wolfe had insisted I make earlier. He took in the scene, eyes narrowing. "So, who is it?" Wolfe didn't move. "The man you want is Griffin Tolliver. He has staged the resurrection of Ballantyne to preserve his own standing, and nearly succeeded in destroying Clay in the process. Arrest him, Inspector!" The room erupted, Michael swearing, Mrs. Ballantyne sobbing, Clay crowing his innocence. Tolliver stood rigid, refusing to speak, until Kramer stepped forward with 2 men and the steel clicked onto his wrists. Only then did he break. "I did it for her!" he burst out, voice raw, eyes flashing toward Mrs. Ballantyne. She needed protection from Clay, from Michael, from ruin. If Avery could not protect her, then I would. I had to make them believe his words choked off as Kramer hauled him away. The door shut, leaving silence that rang louder than shouts. Mrs. Ballantyne collapsed into her chair, white as linen. Clay exhaled, a laugh without humour. Michael buried his face in his hands, and Wolfe sat unmoved, eyes closing, as though the matter were already consigned to memory. "The ambiguity is ended," he said softly. But I knew there was still more to come. Wolfe never left the last word to anyone else. The real reveal of his final articulation was waiting for the next breath. The door had barely shut behind Tolliver and Kramer when the office settled into a silence so taut it seemed the furniture itself might crack. Mrs. Ballantyne sat trembling, her handkerchief shredded in her grip. Michael slouched with the exhaustion of a man who had spent his rage and had nothing left but shame. Clay leaned forward, too eager, ready to seize vindication and parade it like a medal. Wolfe, as immovable as ever, let them stew. His eyes were closed, lips resting, in a line so composed it was hard to tell if he was thinking or napping. I knew better. That was Wolfe in the middle of his orchestration, the pause before the baton drops. He opened his eyes finally, and the weight of them made every head rise. "Mr. Tolliver," he said, though the man was gone, was the craftsman of deception. "But do not presume his guilt explains everything. His contrivances were clever, yes, but cleverness alone cannot sustain such theatre. He was not the sole actor. That pulled them all forward." Clay frowned, his triumph checked. Mrs. Ballantyne's lips parted as though to object, but no words came. Michael straightened, suspicion twitching across his face. Wolfe's gaze lingered on Mrs. Ballantyne. "Madam, you were the target. The ambiguity was woven for you, to unmoor your trust, to inflame your hope, to manipulate your grief. But ask yourself why you, Tolliver, claimed protection. Yes, but protection is not staged through cruelty. He was guided by more than loyalty." Her eyes widened. "Guided by whom?" "By his own weakness," Wolfe said, "and by you." He confessed as much when Kramer led him away. He acted for her. His devotion to you, Mrs. Ballantyne, clouded his judgment. His authorship of the letters was meant to bind you to him, to preserve your dependence on him, not your husband, not Clay, not your son. You. The widow gasped, covering her mouth. Her eyes shone with horror and dawning recognition. Clay seized the moment, turning to her. "You see? Tolliver was deranged, obsessed. He hated me because Avery trusted me. He tried to ruin me to keep you clinging to him." Wolfe's hand rose, silencing him. "Do not congratulate yourself, Mr. Clay. Tolliver was obsessed, but obsession requires soil to grow. You cultivated that soil with your own ambition, your hunger for control. Tolliver feared you, yes, but fear is not born without cause. You were shifting assets before the funeral flowers wilted." Clay reddened, but said nothing. Michael leaned forward, fists clenched. "So what are you saying, Wolfe? That Tolliver did it all out of love? That he invented a ghost just to keep Mother's attention?" Wolfe shook his head. "Not love. Possession. Tolliver mistook loyalty for a claim. His theatre was not designed to protect Mrs. Ballantyne from you or from Clay. It was designed to make her feel only he could protect her. He believed that if ambiguity persisted, if Avery's death remained unresolved, she would need him forever. That is the true perversity of his act. Mrs. Ballantyne made a sound between a sob and a gasp. Michael cursed softly under his breath. Clay sat rigid, trying to appear composed, but his eyes darted like a cornered animal's. Wolfe turned his gaze on him. Do not mistake this outcome for exoneration, Mr. Clay. Tolliver staged the ghost. Yes, but you lit the fuse. Your greed, your haste, your visible ambition made it plausible. He painted you as a villain because you supplied the colors. Clay's mouth twisted. You can't accuse me of theft when no theft has been proved. Not yet, Wolfe said dryly, but Inspector Kramer will not need encouragement to probe your dealings with Vernon Lyle. Tolliver's forgery may have failed, but your overreach will not escape scrutiny. You are not the author of this hoax, but you are not innocent. Michael barked a laugh sharp, bitter. Good. Let him burn. Let him rot. Be still, Wolfe snapped, and Michael flinched. You, young man, are no better. You wished for your father's death not because you accepted grief, but because ambiguity denied you your inheritance. You railed at the uncertainty because it left you powerless. That rage makes you susceptible, if not to crime, then to folly. Do not think yourself free of stain, Michael muttered. Damn you, but his shoulders sagged. At last Wolfe leaned back, exhaling through his nose. The truth, then, is simple. Avery Ballantyne is dead. He was not resurrected, nor did he write letters from the grave. Griffin Tolliver forged the hand, staged the trespasses, and planted the theatre. He did it out of a twisted devotion to Mrs. Ballantyne, and in doing so he nearly destroyed Clay. But he betrayed himself with excess. No ghost writes with such compulsion. Only men, desperate men, do. He reached for his beer and drank deeply as though to wash the taste of the case from his mouth. For a long moment, no one spoke. The case had collapsed into silence. The storm passed. Then Mrs. Ballantyne rose unsteadily. I must go. Her voice shook, and her eyes avoided us all. She walked to the door, trembling but upright, and Fritz escorted her out. Michael followed, cursing under his breath, slamming the door behind him. Clay lingered. He looked at Wolfe, then at me, his expression caught between resentment and reluctant respect. You saved me, Wolfe, even if you hate me for it. I neither save nor hate, Wolfe said coldly. I reveal. Your own conduct will destroy or preserve you. Do not presume my aid will extend beyond tonight. Clay's smile was a flicker, hollow, and then he left too. The office was quiet again. Wolfe leaned back, shut his eyes, and sighed. Phew. The human capacity for delusion is inexhaustible. I sat down across from him. So that's it? Tolliver plays ghostwriter for a corpse, Clay gets dragged through mud, Michael rants, and the widow breaks. All wrapped up with a bow? Wolfe's lips curved faintly. Hardly. Inspector Kramer will wring his satisfaction from Tolliver. Clay's dealings will draw fire. Michael will squander his inheritance in time. The widow will mourn anew, for the truth is crueler than lies. As for us, dinner will be prompt, and I shall take 2 quarts of beer. That was Wolfe's closure ethics, folded into appetite. And me? I just sat there thinking that sometimes a funeral really does come twice, once for the body, and again for the illusions left behind. The brownstone had a way of reclaiming itself once a case drained out the door. Silence, order, the faint smell of Fritz's cooking drifting in from the kitchen. By the time Kramer hauled Tolliver away, and the others scattered like leaves after a gust, Wolfe had already sunk back into his chair, as if the whole storm had been a minor inconvenience to his digestion. I stayed on my feet, restless, running through the chaos in my head. It was always like this. Wolfe delivered the thunderbolt, the room cracked open, and when the dust settled, I was left with the job of fitting the pieces into something that made sense. I paced the rug, hands in my pockets, until Wolfe's voice cut across. "Archie, sit." "You are fidgeting like a terrier at a picnic." I dropped into the red leather chair, leaning forward. "You make it sound simple." Tolliver writes a few letters, stages a couple of break-ins, and suddenly the world thinks Ballantyne's ghost is haunting Madison Avenue. But why did it hold together so long? Why didn't somebody, Clay, Michael, even the widow, smell the trick sooner? "Because," Wolfe said, eyes closed, "men see what they wish to see. The widow wished for hope. Clay wished for justification. Michael wished for release. Each embraced the ambiguity because it suited him. Tolliver only supplied the mask." I thought about that. "And how soon did you know it was him?" "From the beginning," Wolfe said, opening one eye. "Who else had both the skill and access to make such deception plausible?" But suspicion is not proof. Proof required compulsion, the trespasses, the notes. His obsession with perpetuating ambiguity betrayed him. He could not stop himself. I let out a low whistle. "So you strung him along, sat back and waited for him to leave his fingerprints all over the fog." "Precisely." Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. "Patience, Archie. A man reveals himself more fully in theatre than in silence." The phone rang just then, sharp in the quiet. I picked it up. It was Saul. His voice was steady, but I caught the edge under it. "It's done. Kramer's booking Tolliver. He cracked after the ride downtown, confessed to forging the letters, staging the trespasses, even hiring a boy to drop one of the notes. He kept insisting it was for Mrs. Ballantyne's sake. Kramer's chewing nails, but satisfied he's got his man. "Thanks, Saul," I said, and hung up. I relayed the gist to Wolfe, who only grunted, as if the official seal of the law was a footnote to his own conclusion. Dinner that night was more subdued than usual. Fritz served a lamb dish with herbs I couldn't name, and Wolfe consumed it with the concentration of a man judging an international exhibit. I ate quickly, still turning the case over. When the plates were cleared and Wolfe settled with his beer, I asked the question that had been nagging. "Do you think Tolliver would have gone further? Beyond notes and staged break-ins?" Wolfe's eyes opened, steady. Of course, he had already escalated. Each act grew bolder. Left unchecked, he might have manufactured Ballantyne's resurrection entirely. Perhaps a false sighting, perhaps a forged testament. Men possessed by obsession will walk willingly into absurdity. That is why he had to be stopped. That image stuck with me, a loyal secretary turned puppeteer, willing to conjure a dead man's ghost to keep his place in the world. It was grotesque, yes, but also oddly pathetic. Tolliver had no fortune to gain, no estate to seize, only a desperate need to remain necessary. Later that evening I found myself back in the office, lights dim, window cracked to the autumn air. Wolfe had retired to the orchids, leaving me with the silence. I thought of Mrs. Ballantyne, her face when Wolfe named Tolliver. Relief, tangled with betrayal, a widow robbed twice, first of her husband, then of the faith she placed in the man who served him. She would grieve again, maybe harder now, because ambiguity, for all its cruelty, had still carried hope. Certainty was final. Michael would inherit eventually, but I doubted it would bring him peace. His anger had been laid bare, and anger doesn't dissolve with money. Clay would keep fighting, but with the police sniffing around his dealings with Lyle, he had storms ahead. None of them would come out clean. And Wolfe would remain what he always was. A man immovable, untouched, who stripped men of their illusions and left them standing in whatever, light or shadow, they'd earned. I was still chewing on that when Wolfe came back in, wiping his hands on a cloth. He settled into his chair, reached for another bottle of beer, and glanced at me. "You are brooding," he observed. "Maybe. Cases like this stick. Nobody died except the original dead man, but it still feels like bodies all around. You cut the strings, Wolfe, but the pieces don't land anywhere neat." "Life," he said flatly, "is not neat. You mistake order for harmony. I impose order, nothing more." "Yeah, but you do it with style," I said. He allowed the ghost of a smile. "Archie, style is irrelevant. Justice, however imperfect, is the object. That and dinner." That broke the spell a little. I chuckled, leaned back, and let the silence settle again. The city outside carried on, noisy and indifferent. Somewhere Tolliver sat in a cell, his obsession exposed and collapsed. Mrs. Ballantyne lay awake in a house twice emptied. Clay plotted his next angle, Michael his next indulgence, and Wolfe sat in his chair, steady as the earth, another case dismantled and filed away in the vault of his mind. For me, it was another entry in the record, another puzzle unraveled by Wolfe's brain while I chased shadows across the city. Another reminder that a funeral can come twice, once in the earth and once in the hearts of those left behind. Wolfe finished his beer, set it down, and closed his eyes. "Enough. Tomorrow we return to the orchids, and Fritz will roast squabs." "Fine by me," I said, switching off the lamp. "Just as long as nobody shows up at the door claiming the squabs wrote them a letter." That earned me the soft rumble of Wolfe's laugh, rare and deep. And with that, the brownstone settled back into the quiet that always followed the storm.